The greatest last stands in human history. Don Alejo Garza Tamez was born in July 1933 in Allende, Nuevo Leon, a town in northern Mexico. Don Alejo's family ran a sawmill, and he was raised learning the trade and slowly expanding his property, eventually buying a ranch. But in 2010, Don Alejo's ranch had the misfortune of existing in an area that would be a great checkpoint for the drug trade, thus drawing the attention of the Los Zetas gang. The Los Zetas are a cartel gang known for, they were not nice people. They were a former Mexican military that was trained to be a task force against the cartels, but then they realized they could make a lot more money by joining the drug trade, so that leads us to where we are today. On the 13th of November 2010, the cartel approached Don Alejo and asked him very nicely and not at all threateningly to vacate the premises in 24 hours in a real estate deal in which they would pay nothing in exchange for getting to live another day. Honestly, not the worst real estate offer I've heard of. Pretty generous. I would have taken it. But Don Alejo was a principled old man, 77 years old and the absolute pinnacle of humanity. This man hit him with the "I'll be waiting," and then the cartel just left and prepared to come back with backup. Don Alejo calmly grabbed his collection of guns and set them up at each window of the house. Within 24 hours, the cartel arrived. Don Alejo told them to leave, and they shot at him. So immediately he shot the two closest gangsters and the firefight commenced. The cartel began opening fire on Don Alejo's house, shooting at the window that he fired from. Except that he had already moved to another window and shot two more gangsters dead. And as they shifted to that window, he was already gone, moving from window to window. Eventually, the cartel got sick of it and kicked open the door, only to see him there, guns in hand. They were wounded but not killed. The cartel decided enough was enough, and they started using just grenades on Don Alejo's house. After blowing up a bunch of stuff, they retreated before the military could arrive. And about an hour later, the military did show up, and they found the aftermath of the firefight. Over 900 bullets were fired into Don Alejo's house, and multiple just complete craters from grenades were found. Sadly, the man was found dead in his bathroom, rifle still pointing to the door as he succumbed to the bullet wounds he received during the firefight. But still, he's an absolute legend. I don't usually cover recent stuff, but this was just too good. Sempronius Densis. The story of Sempronius Densis is less a story about him and more a story about Rome during a period of time in which Rome was at its most Roman, if you get what I mean. It was the year 69 AD. This wasn't just funny due to the number, but also that Rome decided to go through 4 emperors in a single year: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. To begin with, I think it's safe to say that most people probably have a grasp of how Nero was as an emperor. He was psychotic and unhinged, he did some weird stuff involved killing his wife and replacing her with a dude that looked like her, and that's just one of the many, many stories of Nero's unhingedness. I could go through tons of stories about Nero, but all you really need to know is that he was hated by most of Rome by the time he was dethroned. And the first person to take his place was a silly little guy named Galba. Galba's first action as the self-proclaimed emperor was to march on Rome to claim his throne, as Galba was nowhere near Rome when Nero died. When Galba reached Rome, he had every soldier in the Roman garrison, unarmed or otherwise, killed, which immediately did not make him very popular. Otho, a governor at the time, who had sided with Galba, began to see that he was slowly losing favor by making more and more drastic mistakes. His fall was imminent, and Galba was the most unpopular with the military, while Otho was really popular after befriending many of the Praetorian guards over the years, even going as far as to settle one of their debts with his own money. Eventually, Otho knew his time had come, and so with the help of the Praetorian Guard and some other fed-up Romans, he marched on Rome, causing a riot to break out. Galba and his heir went out into the crowd to try and reassure them and calm them down, and he was surrounded by guards. But when the guards saw Otho and his militia making their way through the crowd, every single one of them abandoned Galba. All except one. Yup, that's right, 7 paragraphs in, and I'm now bringing up Sempronius Densis. He's incredibly uninteresting as a person, but his final act here is just absolutely legendary. Sempronius refused to allow the militia to pass, and he held his ground against the soldiers who all wanted to kill Galba. Sempronius stood alone and defended Galba to the end. Unfortunately, we have no idea how long he fought for, or if he even killed anyone at all. But goddamn was he brave. He was noted and remembered for this act of valor, despite his idea to sacrifice himself for a pretty mid-emperor, all things considered. Granted, Galba didn't even serve a year. Pretty unfortunate, but hey, you gotta do what you gotta do. Okay, this next one is completely insane. We're talking about Vito Bertoldo. So this guy was a soldier in World War II. He was 25 when Pearl Harbor happened, and he decided to join the military despite his poor eyesight disqualifying him from the draft. His eyesight made him unable to be put into combat roles, but after requesting a transfer from his current job as a military police, he was given the role of a cook on the front lines in France. And while at a command post, he was volunteered as a guard. It was there when he noticed a group of Germans approaching off in the distance. And so he ran out into the streets with his gun and set himself up as the sole defensive line. For the next half a day, he stood fighting off the approach by himself while being shot at with everything from pistols to tanks. Yeah, that's right. Tanks. Plural. As in for 12 hours, this dude stood out in the open with his guns, fighting off soldiers and multiple tanks who were shelling the area around him with 8mm guns. You know, the guns designed to take down airplanes and other tanks. All those guns firing at a single guy. Just had to hammer home how impressive that is. After the 12 hours passed, Vito ran back inside the command post and took cover behind a table with his machine gun. From there, he fired through a window to hit oncoming enemies. But then one of the tanks shot a shell into the room which sent him flying. But this dude was hacking or something because he got back up and picked up his gun as 2 APCs in a tank rolled up on him. He waited for an opening before peeking out the window again and firing as the soldiers jumped out of the APCs and the tank fired at him. It's said that he mowed down 20 combatants here alone. Much later, the command post was finally changed to another building, as the tanks just kept pummeling the area. Vito stayed behind to cover everyone, and remained watching their flank for the entire night. The morning after, he swapped over to a different building, the command post of a different battalion, and spent the next 24 hours defending that area. So, to recap, he's already been up for 24 hours straight fighting and dodging tanks. You think it's bad having to wake up early for school? Imagine how much infinitely more tired you'd be in this guy's shoes. Vito then fought off a tank, 2 heavy artillery guns, and 15 German infantry. It's said that the mobile artillery gun, which is more or less a tank, basically stuffed its barrel into the building that Vito was in and fired, sending him to the ground and messing up his allies. Then a team of friendly bazookas set the artillery truck on fire as Vito stood up and shot the people operating the flaming vehicle. Just such an insane guy. Then someone in charge finally got the bright idea to evacuate at night, but before they could put the plan to work, another assault started with ranged artillery and more tanks. So Vito's going on 48 hours of no sleep, and he begins fighting the attackers with white phosphorus grenades, which made them stop advancing, because if you know anything about white phosphorus, it's that you don't want to be anywhere near it. So the attacking soldiers made the smart decision to not walk into the white fog of death. So Vito holds the angle with his gun, and a tank shot at his location, sending him flying as it destroys his gun. But Vito still got back up and grabbed a new gun and fought to cover the withdrawal of his comrades again. And finally, after all this happens, he makes his way out, the last one to leave. I'm speechless. Never in my life have I seen someone roll so many consecutive nat 20s. Like, how did this man do it? I'm not kidding, this guy was absolutely nuts. Alright, these next two are probably the most popular, and considering how similar they are, they're gonna be together as the epitome of fighting until the very last breath. First up is the Viking of Stamford Bridge. So around 1066, Harald Hardrada of Norway was invading England to take it from the current king, Harold Godwinson. And the most extraordinary battle was in Stamford Bridge, which ironically was not the name of the bridge, but rather the name of the village that they fought in. Anyway, the fight was a losing battle for the Vikings. They retreated across a bridge, and one Viking remained, standing upon it wielding a Dane axe. The English tried to fight him, but every person on the front line was killed by the Viking. Every wave introduced more and more Englishmen fighting on the bridge, but the Viking with the Dane axe just continued to cut them down. 40 men attempted to cross the bridge, and 40 men failed. This random Viking was only stopped when an English soldier snuck underneath the bridge and stabbed him with a spear, which killed him. That Viking's death led to the invading force being routed and the English won, but their pride was heavily bruised. One guy killing 40 dudes, that's just embarrassing. This battle was especially amazing because it's remembered due to a fight on a bridge, but the village nearby was named Stamford Bridge. The two leaders were named Harold and Harold, and the lone Viking is called the Viking of Stamford Bridge, which really does not help with clarity, because is he the Viking of the bridge or the Viking of the town who died on a bridge in Stamford Bridge? But anyway, just something to think about. This whole Viking on the bridge thing is very similar to another story about a monk named Benke. Benke was a monk in the late 1180s, serving a samurai named Yoshitsune. There's a whole veritable feast of history between these two, but in Benkei's final moments, much like the Viking in Stanford 100 years earlier, it took place on a bridge. Yoshitsune was retreating to his castle to commit seppuku, and he needed time. So Benkei bought him that time by guarding the bridge as hundreds of samurai approached. The story goes that Benkei remained on the bridge with his Nagakiba at the ready. Wave after wave of samurai charged against him. Legend has it that he killed 500 samurai before they decided to just shoot Benkei with arrows. Yeah, these old last stands are always really embellished. But anyway, after however many samurai actually died, they decided to be cautious and to shoot arrows at Benkei instead. Benkei remained standing despite being a pincushion of arrows, so the samurai didn't approach anymore. Eventually, after some waiting, they did approach the bridge to see that he had propped himself up on his weapon and was long dead. Which brought Yoshitsune enough time to commit seppuku, so W friend, I guess. This next one's a fun one. We're gonna need to go back over 1,000 years before Benkei and the Viking of Stamford Bridge. Agis III. Agis III was the son of the king of Sparta, Archimedes III, and he'd witnessed Sparta's decline in both power and social standing. Agis' father left Greece to fight against Macedonia, which was Alexander the Great's kingdom, along with fighting a few other Greek city-states. Archimedes did this after he and Agis fought off the Thebans just a decade earlier in some weird father-son bonding experience in which they tried to regain Sparta's lost land. Anyway, all that aside, but then Archimedes did the dad thing, and he went off on his own to find the illustrious pack of cigarettes, which means he became a mercenary commander, and when he saw the size difference between his army and the Macedonians, he dipped out, saying something like, "You guys got this, I gotta go grab a drink, be right back." And then he just vanished. We find out later that he was killed the same day when he was caught in another battle. Anyway, so Agis had been holding down the house, keeping it tidy for when his dad came back with the cigarettes that he'd promised, but instead he got a knock on the door. It was a messenger, telling him that his father passed away in a tragic cigarette-related 4-car pileup, and now he owned the house and had to pay taxes. I don't think this bid's making any sense. Okay, wait, scratch all of that. Okay, anyway, Agis was king and Archidamus was dead. That's all you need to know. And so Sparta's land was divided up to its neighbors and enemies. Agis knew that it would take time for Sparta to recover, so he bided his time and waited for Macedonia to drop its guard. He sent out messengers to speak with various Persian military leaders, contractors, and even the king himself, asking for military supplies and asking them to attack Greece. The Persians did not need to be asked twice, and so they did, which marked the beginnings of a new war against Macedonia. 2 years later, Agis and some other Greek kingdoms who were opposed to Macedonian rule declared war against Alexander's kingdom, which is Macedonia. And after a successful battle, Agis moved forward to siege the great city of Megalopolis, which is where Agis made his last stand. Unfortunately for Agis, the city held against the siege, and a relief army made its way to battle Agis. The battle was lost and he was wounded. While he and his men were retreating and they were carrying him, he realized he was dead weight, and so he told his men to leave him and retreat faster. Staying behind, unable to stand, he fought on his knees and killed a few of the approaching Macedonians. Eventually, he was killed by a javelin. And like so many other stories of last stands, his life was cut short by a sneak attack or a thing he couldn't reasonably defend himself from. You'd be surprised how many last stand stories end that way, at least in the ancient world. Okay, now we're talking about Roy Benavides. So this man was a staff sergeant in the Vietnam War, and he has a really cool story. But to keep it simple, this guy was made of tough stuff. He was undercover and he stepped on a landmine, and then he got rescued and sent to a hospital where he would, against doctor's orders, crawl across the ground and try to lift himself up against a wall. And he just did that until he could walk again. Yeah, this guy just speedran recovery so he could get back to Vietnam. 2 years later, now in 1968, Roy was in a forward operating base in Loc Ninh. Recently, a 12-man Special Forces recon team was dropped into a jungle west of the Loc Ninh area. They were pinned down and needed extraction, but the helicopters weren't able to land due to the hail of gunfire being laid down on them. And so Roy hears this distress call over the radio, and he saw the helicopters landing at the base to refuel, so he immediately volunteers to go help in a second extraction attempt. The 12-man team was either dead or wounded, and they needed help fast. Keep in mind that Roy was also part of this battle. So Roy got into the helicopter and they flew over. When they got to the 12-man team, the helicopter got as close as it could, and Roy jumped out and sprinted to the team. While doing so, he took a bullet to his right leg and a bullet hit his helmet. Upon reaching the group of injured soldiers, he proactively took charge and helped to pinpoint where the team should focus their gunfire. He then threw a few smoke grenades to alert the helicopter of his and the rest of the team's position. He shot some suppressing fire at the enemies while the other guys extracted, and he then searched for and found the dead squad leader's body and classified documents on it, which would not have been good if they fell into enemy hands. As he was carrying the body in safety, he was shot in the abdomen, and a grenade exploded, sending shrapnel into his back. While that was happening, he also saw the helicopter pilot get shot and crash with everyone inside. So immediately he secured the documents and sprinted to the downed helicopter and pulled people out of the wreckage to create a defensive perimeter, entrenching everyone in a safer but unsustainable defensive position. And so while the enemy fired upon the group, Roy was making sure everyone was holding up as he called in airstrikes to make another extraction attempt possible. But as he was doing that, another few bullets hit him in the thigh while he was fixing up the injuries of another team member. But that did not stop him. Just as the new extraction helicopter landed, Roy, one by one, carried the injured soldiers to the aircraft. He did it in multiple trips, and his second trip had him ambushed by an enemy soldier who he fought and killed with a knife, but not before sustaining a bayonet wound or two. Just as we go along, keep track of his injuries in your head. He's been shot a few times, stabbed a few times, and he's got some shrapnel in him. As he carried the last of the men to the helicopter, he saw two men approaching, and so he killed them before checking to see if all classified information and injured people were collected. And then he passed out from the pain and was dragged onto the helicopter. He managed to save 8 men after sustaining 37 bullet, shrapnel, and bayonet wounds. He was so exhausted and bloody that his eyes had fused shut. He was presumed dead, but as the doctor was zipping the body bag, he spat into the doctor's face to prove he was still alive. What a goddamn legend. These stories are just so unreal. In fact, when Roy received his Medal of Honor, Ronald Reagan even said that if it were a movie, I would not believe it. The most dangerous jobs in human history. The first job on the list is the tin opener. What's that, you may be asking? Okay, picture a dude opening a tin can. But the can is under 12,000 feet of water and surrounded by explosives. Now, take that mental image and replace the tin can with a submarine. Okay, maybe the explanation could have been slightly more clear. Basically, in World War I, submarines were really useful. Both sides would stuff their submarines full of secret codes and messages, knowing that more likely than not, if that submarine would be destroyed, then so would the contents of the machine. And that was mostly true. More often than not, the secret codes and messages locked inside submarines would stay there forever, completely unrecoverable. But that didn't stop both sides from trying. Which is where these guys come in. The tin openers. Their job was to try to break into these sunken submarines to get to the secrets inside. While I'm talking about this job, just keep in mind that this was during World War I. We didn't have crazy modern diving equipment or anything of the sort. Think of a diving suit as a metal tube that just happened to have oxygen inside of it. I mean, look at this dude. Does that look comfortable in any way? I don't think so. But the danger of this job wasn't just due to comfort, or even due to the suits as a matter of fact. Think about it this way. The submarines they were looking for were at the bottom of the ocean. How'd they end up there? Most of the time it's because they were blown up by mines. Yep, that's right. The submarines would often be in the middle of a minefield. So even if you did every dang thing perfectly, your suit never malfunctioned and you made it all the way down, well, there's a good chance a random mine will decide, my time is now, and commit genocide on itself. Oh yeah, and one more thing I'd like for you to keep in mind. The way they got into these subs wasn't by just opening a door. Nah, that'd be too safe. The most common method to get into the subs was via explosive, because why not detonate a powerful explosive in the middle of a minefield? Yeah, these dudes did not have the highest of survival rates, but they're nothing compared to some of the jobs coming up next. It only gets more deadly from here. Next up, we got the lime burners. To understand what a lime burner does, first you need to understand what quicklime is. It's got a ton of uses. The main ones historically used are holding buildings up and burning people's eyes out. So maybe those two functions have given you a small idea as to why it's so deadly. The role of lime burners was to put this stuff together inside of factories. But don't worry, quicklime isn't reactive or explosive in any way, unless it comes into contact with water. And I mean water in any form, like for example, sweat. Hey, did I mention that quicklime is created inside of a furnace at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit? Truly unfortunate. The situation a lot of the time would end up with the quicklime reacting to water in some way, mostly to the detriment of the worker. To get a truly good picture of what happens when you come into contact with it, allow me to read out the list of symptoms. Coughing, sneezing, and labored breathing to begin with. After that, it evolves. In this stage, it can burn holes in the nasal septum, which is the thing that separates your nostrils. It can cause extreme abdominal pain and vomiting. Also, I just want to throw this in here. It can also produce enough heat to light things around it on fire. Quick public service announcement to any lime burners in the audience. Try not to touch quicklime. It's not beneficial to your health. Glad I could help. No need to thank me. There was one time a Roman general was fighting these dudes named the Characatani, who had managed to hide in caves that the Romans couldn't access. Instead of charging blindly into the caves and losing all of his men, the Roman general decided to use the old military strategy of flinging stuff at them until they surrender or die. In this case, the stuff was quicklime powder. The general had his men pile up large mounds of limestone dust at the entrance of the cave. The Characatani didn't think much of it at first, but the next day the wind blew the quicklime into the cave, and the Characatani began to suffer immensely, choking on the dust as their eyes and throats were severely irritated. After 3 days of complete suffering, the Characatani surrendered. That's a pretty terrifying substance to work with. You know another pretty terrifying substance to work with? That's right, military-grade explosives. Welcome to the wonderful career known as being a petardier. You heard the saying, hoisted by your own petard? That was about these dudes, the petardiers. Okay, I've been saying that word a lot, but what does it mean? Well, a petard is a cone-shaped thing full of explosive material. It was used often during wars, because when ransacking someone's castle, the main obstacle between you and their vast riches is often the giant walls. So to overcome said obstacle, some dude had the genius idea to create this thing, the petard. You fill it with explosive powder, attach it to a weak point in the wall, and light it. At that point, it's a mad dash to cover. This was one of the most dangerous parts of the job. Think about it, petards aren't light. They often took like 4 guys to carry, and you're carrying it through an active battlefield towards an enemy castle. The enemy knows how dangerous that thing is. So they're doing everything in their power to crack your skull, or to even set off the petard. If by some miracle you make it to the weak point in their castle wall, which I'd like to add is the most heavily defended, then you have to affix a live bomb to the wall. You stand there, light it, then sprint full speed in the other direction. The phrase from earlier, hoisted by your own petard, comes from the fact that being blown up by your own bomb was incredibly common. What an interesting profession. Next up, we got the sappers. If you have claustrophobia, you would be a great fit for this job. That's because the sappers were miners, but not normal miners. These guys would only work during battles, tunneling underneath the battlefield in the hopes of getting to the enemy castle. They would tunnel all the way under a battlefield towards the enemy castle, stone by stone. As they went, they would support the tunnel with wooden beams to prevent it from collapsing. Once they got there, they would just start removing the foundation stones to try to destroy the castle. Once they removed enough, they would light a fire and burn down the wooden timbers holding up the tunnel, then sprint out of there as the tunnel collapsed. These guys were actually some of the most effective fighters on the whole battlefield. But maybe you can see where some of the danger lay. So many times the tunnel would just collapse on the sappers, crushing them in tons of dirt and rock. Even when the tunnels didn't collapse, there were plenty of other threats. First of all, if the enemy found your tunnel, you're definitely screwed, since there's literally no escape. Second, enemy sappers are also a threat. Both sides knew how useful this tactic was, so they both used sappers. And on occasion, these miners would discover each other. And at that point, the battle was bloody. Most often, being discovered meant death for the sappers, as enemies would just enter the tunnels and kill them. Turns out that this was actually the best and maybe only defense against them. Yeah, being a sapper was insanely deadly, but unfortunately miners weren't very well respected in the military. So not only did they die incredibly often, they also weren't held in high esteem. Yeah, go dig your tunnel, dirt boy. Being a sapper sounds pretty terrible, but at least it wasn't as horrifying as this next one. Welcome to the wonderful world of being a plague body collector. Europe, mid-1300s. The Black Plague hits the continent like a truck, filled with plague. People were dying by the thousands of thousands, otherwise known as the millions. As bodies piled up in streets and houses, the job of moving those bodies out of cities fell upon one group of people, a heroic bunch known as the body collectors. And yes, it's exactly as glamorous as it sounds. The job consisted of breaking into dead people's homes, checking for said dead people, grabbing the corpses, loading them onto a cart, and then moving on to the next house. there were a shit ton of bodies to collect during the Black Plague. Ironically, body collection was one of the most stable careers around that time because everyone was dying to plague. It was a bit of a trend. Unfortunately for the body collectors, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Who knew, right? The funny thing about the Black Plague was that it spreads insanely fast and efficiently. And if you're coming into contact with bodies all day, things don't look too good for your survival odds. A ton of body collectors would die from the plague, and let me tell you, it was not pretty. The main sign of the bubonic plague was buboes. The victim would be covered in these black spots that were filled with pus, and that would occasionally explode. As the plague attacked your body and your condition reached critical levels, you would start to cough blood before a final seizure would take you down. So yeah, pretty lovely stuff. One of the main strategies of the body collectors was known as corpse lasagna, whereby they dug an incredibly deep pit. Then they'll throw corpses into said pit, then throw dirt on them. Then they'd add more corpses, and so on until the pit is filled. Then they do it again, hence the name, lasagna. Despite all the horrors, being a body collector was a very desired job. Not for the safety and fun of the job itself, but because those dudes got paid so much. I mean, you'd have to be paid a ton to do a job with a 90% chance of horrifying death. Yeah, being a body collector was a cruel and thankless job. But you know what? At least people weren't actively trying to kill you. Which unfortunately was the case with our next job. Okay, maybe they weren't trying to kill you specifically, but maybe indirectly. That's because our next job is food taster. This was a person that would be assigned to someone who might be the target of assassinations. Before every meal, the food taster would, guess what? Taste a bit of said person's food. The point was to see if the food was poisoned, and if it was, things wouldn't fare too well for the food taster. If an assassin wanted to get to the king, they'd have to get through his food taster first. Which wasn't that hard because they're just dudes, and those dudes died a lot. Kings would burn through food tasters like crazy. There was one interesting story involving Cleopatra and a food taster. Cleo and Mark Antony were in a relationship, but a bit of a sketchy one. You know, the classic troubles new couples go through. She was a bit of a maniac, he was worried she wanted to kill him. Little stuff like that. But never fear, because dearest Cleo had a solution to his worries. See, Mark Antony had a food taster. And remember, food tasters aren't rich, so therefore, they don't matter. Cleo told Mark to put a flower from her garland into his drink, then told him to drink it. He was about to do it, but then Cleo told him to stop, and got his food taster to drink it instead. The food taster didn't really have a choice in the matter, and he took a drink. Within minutes, he was dead. Cleo then goes, "If I wanted to kill you, I could've." Now, this was supposed to be a story about how cool Cleopatra is, but I can't help but feel bad for this food taster and all the others that came before him. It's just pretty messed up, you know? He was used just as a prop. That shows how dangerous their jobs were. They could be killed at a moment's notice. The worst punishment from every time period. Fun fact, there was an entire city in ancient Egypt that was full of people who didn't have any noses. Sounds kind of strange, but it's actually true. The city is called Rhino Cholera, and it means nose cutters in Greek. In order to actually end up in this city, you'd have to commit a bad crime, since that kind of punishment was only used on the most dangerous criminals. Okay, so imagine you just killed someone, and you were sent to Rhino Cholera. What would that look like? Well, for starters, your nose would be brutally hacked off, and you'd be sent to the prison. Now that you look like Voldemort's cousin, it's time to get settled into the prison, and make sure you enjoy your stay here, because after you die, you're not going to be making it to the afterlife. That's because the Egyptians believed that keeping your body intact was crucial to making the journey to the afterlife once you were dead. So, by removing part of someone's body, you would ruin the journey for them, which would mean they don't make it to the afterlife. But now that you're in prison, it's not so bad. Apart from the fact that you barely get to eat, everything's diseased, and you're forced to work all day with very few breaks. But hey, at least you don't have to smell the corpses on the ground. You know, no nose and all that. And if you somehow survived your sentence, you would never be able to fit into society again because your noseless face was a sign that you were a criminal, meaning you'd just be homeless for the rest of your life. So, for future reference, just try not to commit any heinous crimes. Or if that's too difficult, just try not to get your nose cut off. Now, with that image stuck in my mind, it's time to move on to the next time period. One of my personal favorites, the ancient Greeks. These guys are known for being pretty damn smart. They invented stuff like medicine, the alarm clock, vending machines. Ah, and of course, putting people inside bronze statues of bulls and burning them alive. Yup, we knew it was coming. Time to talk about the brazen bull. It was used on people like enemies of the state, criminals, or pretty much anyone that the leaders didn't like. If you were one of the lucky few that were sent on a one-way trip into this personal spa, you would not enjoy it, to say the least. First, they'd kind of just beat you up, and then they'd whip you, so you wouldn't have enough energy to do anything about your impending doom, and then you'd be tossed into the bull. At the start, it wouldn't feel that bad. It would just be like mildly hot. But soon, things would start to heat up, to a point where the water on your skin would begin to boil like a dumpling getting steamed. But unlike a dumpling, you feel pain. And the pain you're experiencing is impossible to put into words. At one point, your skin literally starts carbonizing. If you don't know what that means, picture a piece of meat on a grill that's burning and turning into a coal. A piece of coal. Yeah, it would probably hurt. Kind of a funny story, the maker of the machine was actually tricked into going into the bowl to demonstrate the acoustics. But before he could get out, they locked him and toasted him alive. Yep, stories don't get much funnier than that. You know what else is funny? That's right, getting nailed into barrels. Whoa, crazy coincidence, that's exactly what they did in the ancient Persian Empire. Okay, this story is really disturbing, so if you're eating right now, tough luck. Getting nailed into barrels is even worse than it sounds, since the nailing part is only the beginning of the torture method. First, they'd put honey and milk all over your body, before putting you into a barrel with your head or hand sticking out. This itself isn't too bad, because it would only be mildly uncomfortable. So after that, the hammer nails into the barrel, which would stab the victim if they tried to move. And you're probably wondering what the honey was for, right? And no, it's not for Winnie the Pooh cosplay. They did it because after they put the nails in, they would force feed you rotten food that was infected with parasites. These parasites would feast their way through your organs as your body started to rot. After about 2 weeks of this, they would finally die. Yummy. Next up, the early Middle Ages are sometimes called the Dark Ages, which is because pretty much everything went wrong during that time, like trading and classical learning, for example. But one thing's for sure, coming up with new torture methods is not on that list. During this time, they came up with all sorts of crazy methods of hurting someone, like for example, the breaking wheel. You can probably figure out how this works. You pretty much just tie someone to a wheel and have the strongest guy you know whack them with an iron bar until their bones snap. For the people on the wheel, they would wish it ended there, but nope, we still have a lot of torture left. Once they sorta just broke all the bones you have, they would start weaving your broken limbs through the wheel, causing an insane amount of pain. Cause like, imagine you broke your pointer fingers and you had to jam them into a Chinese finger trap. Yeah, that'd be an equivalent amount of pain to the breaking wheel. Yep, totally, that's a good metaphor. Anyway, in drawings from the early Middle Ages, you would see people whose arms are literally bending in 6 different places, which is more places than a normal arm is supposed to bend in. And I know what you're probably wondering. Did it spin? Yes it did. In some cases, they would spin the wheel like some sort of cartel Ferris wheel, so the crowd can watch as the victim gets slowly rotated, which would cause their broken limbs to slide around, causing a lot of pain. They could either have the wheel be horizontal or vertical, depending on how the executioner was feeling that day. It's not exactly known if this torture method was always lethal, but in most cases the victim would die from blood loss or just pure exhaustion from the torture. The entire wheel with your body on it would then be displayed as a warning sign for anyone who might think about committing any crimes. Yeah, cool. You know what's better than being horrifically maimed? That's right, privacy. Literally thousands of companies are currently collecting and trading our data. I've had experiences where I gave my email address to some random site so I can access an article that I need for one of these videos, only to discover that I've condemned myself to eternally getting spam calls and emails from mainland China. Seriously, why is it always mainland China? A lot of times, the companies or services that we sign up for are selling our personal information. From your legal name to home address to social security number. Wait, we're supposed to keep those secret? Okay, the thing is, we do have a legal right to request that these companies storing our information delete everything they have on us. But that's a long and tedious process. It can literally take years of back and forth to do it yourself. Fortunately, we can just get Incogni to do it. Sign up for Incogni, then just sit back and relax. Watch as their legal team forces these companies to delete that precious personal information. Watch as they metaphorically invade mainland China, or whatever other legal magic they do. I just signed up and look at all these companies that have already removed my data. Nice. Go to incogni.com/Kelevin and use code Kelevin to get an exclusive offer of 60% off. That is incogni.com/Kelevin, and link is in the description. Use code Kelevin or click the link below to take your personal data off the market. Thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this video. Honestly, the Renaissance was a pretty metal time in terms of punishments. Like, imagine if I worked at the police and I interrogated someone by having rats eat through their body. I'd probably be sent to jail or a mental institution for being batshit crazy. But this, weirdly enough, actually happened multiple times. For example, during the Dutch Revolt, the Dutch people were kind of pissed at the Spanish for ruling over them. So they had like a whole war going on that lasted 80 years, blah blah, but that's not important, we're here for rat torture. One of the people that was involved in this revolt was Diedrich Sonoy. This guy was a military leader and he was already known for being pretty insane, using very interesting techniques during battle and overall just being a silly guy. At one point, this silly little guy really didn't like one of the prisoners they had. So he filled up a bowl with rats, placing it against the prisoner's stomach and lit it on fire. Now, because the rats were scared of the fire, they started trying to eat their way out. And since they couldn't get through the metal bowl, they went through the prisoner's body. Yeah, the rats straight up ate their way through this guy's flesh, then his organs, and out the back in order to escape the fire. That must have been an extremely slow and painful death, and yeah, no wonder it's not allowed today. The 1940s were known for all sorts of things. For example, Frank Sinatra became popular during this time, and the Second World War broke out. This new war brought with it a lot of death and pain, most of which happened from getting shot on the battlefield. But during the war, they also invented a bunch of new torture methods. Like, for example, bamboo torture. The Japanese would restrain someone above a bunch of young bamboo plants. Now, the cool thing about bamboo is that it grows insanely fast, at 1.5 inches per hour, and it pretty much grows through anything that you put in front of it. So you could probably imagine what would happen when you put bamboo below a living person. At first, the bamboo just pushes against the victim's body, but slowly over time, it would start to go through their skin, then their organs, and it would come out through the other side. This form of punishment could take several days to kill someone, and it's for sure one of the most brutal forms of torture out there. It's unclear if bamboo torture had been used before the Second World War, and it's also not clear just how often bamboo torture was actually used, but it sure did work for the Japanese as a way to scare and control prisoners of war. Now it's time for the modern ones, and I can honestly say, we as humans have really not lost any of our skills. We're still really good at causing pain. Go us! The first of the modern methods is called necklacing, and to be honest, when I read this, I didn't think it was real, but here we are. It starts by grabbing a person by the neck and placing a gasoline-filled tire over their heads, which locks them in place. The victim is then set on fire, which keeps getting fueled from the gasoline that's in the tire. At this point, you're just straight up burning alive, and the tire is now also starting to drip melting rubber onto your skin, which only causes more pain. In total, around 300 to 700 people have died from necklacing, mostly being criminals or sex offenders. This method isn't really used by the Western world, and it's only really being used in Africa. But that doesn't mean that the Western world doesn't have their own weird torture methods. An example of one of these is white torture. You may have heard of this method before because it's pretty well known, but if you don't, here's how it goes. First, they sort of just dump you into a white room with nothing around you but the color white, white rice on a white plate, white guard uniforms that wear special shoes to muffle their steps, you get the idea. Leaving someone in a room like this with no outside stimulation would cause them to go crazy, which is exactly the point. And it's very effective. People legitimately do go crazy inside these rooms. The most bizarre cults in human history. Alright, first up, we got the Appalachian Snake Church. And you're never gonna guess what reptile they're obsessed with. Snakes. It's snakes. This church started in the early 1900s, founded by George Went Hensley, who died of old age in 1955. I'm just kidding, he died to a rattlesnake bite. Who would have guessed, right? Absolute shocker. The church figured that handling the snakes with the strongest venom shows the strongest faith. And sure, many people are happy to express their faith through songs or some community help, but the Appalachian Snake Church took a different approach. The concept was straightforward but kind of crazy. If your belief was strong enough, dealing with snakes wouldn't lead to, the emergency room. Followers just thought that if they were bitten, their faith would keep them safe from danger. And let's just say they put this belief to the test. Many times. Well, the problem was that sometimes the snakes didn't get the message. Bites happened very often, and while some were seen as just part of the experience, others turned out to be very deadly. Emphasis on the dead. Lee. This group's special way of showing their devotion brought them fame. They were in some documentaries and stuff. Look, if my pastor's wrangling a frickin' python, you better believe I'm gonna listen like a good child. The Raelian movement. Alright, for this next one, you really gotta hear what they believed in first to get the full experience. So, for your information, 25,000 years ago, an alien race called the Elohim arrived. I have no idea what they're supposed to look like, so we're just gonna use this dude to represent them. So, 25,000 years ago, the Elohim arrived, and bam, they made life. Actually, they didn't just create it, that'd be crazy. They used laboratories. And then bam, they created life. And then I guess they left for 25,000 years for some reason, until this guy was born. Claude Vorilhon, the founder of the Raelian movement. Yep, this whole story has been according to him. He's the leader of the cult and the provider of all of our information. Why? And why does he get this role? Because, again, according to him, the Elohim came back after that 25,000 year gap and decided to make this man our prophet. His goal was apparently to warn humanity that we're in our age of apocalypse after the bomb dropped in Hiroshima. We had to either choose to destroy ourselves or to live peacefully. And I guess thank the Elohim for Claude, because he must have been the one that stopped us from blowing ourselves up. Now, I know what you're thinking. Please tell me he wrote a book. And dear viewer, you are in good fortune, because of course he did. He first wrote one called The Book Which Tells the Truth, followed shortly by Extraterrestrials Took Me to Their Planet. In it, he described being taken to their planet. No way. And while he was there, he learned about their society, where only the most smartest people were chosen to be the leaders. So, how do you join? First up, you gotta get baptized. The process is called transmission, or the cellular plan if you're weird. So, first up, you gotta get a priest. Then, it's gotta be on a specific date, like the date that the A-bomb dropped, or like the day that Claude met Jesus, Muhammad, and Buddha on the Raelian spaceship. Special dates like that. And no, I won't be elaborating on the spaceship thing. From there, someone will sprinkle a few drops of water on your forehead. Then everyone joins hands in a circle around you. And, obviously, that sends your genetic code over to the Elohim, who will now make you immortal and stuff. The only catch is that you have to donate 10% of your income to Claude, so he can build a church or something. But that's small potatoes compared to immortality, right? The Church of Euthanasia. Many people believe that saving the environment is about recycling and using reusable bags. Many people are incorrect. The Church of Euthanasia is ready to take things much further. Established in 1992, this church supports population control by promoting voluntary death. Their motto, protect the earth, end your life. Subtle, isn't it? The Church of Euthanasia was started by Reverend Chris Korda, who viewed humanity as a problem for the planet, and figured that reducing the number of people was the only way to help save the earth. They told people to just stop having kids and overall to not contribute to the issue of overpopulation. The group also provided a list of useful suggestions, which included supporting safe methods of euthanasia. Safe methods of euthanasia. Yup, because nothing represents caring for the environment like encouraging people to lower their carbon footprint for good. And naturally, the church's method hasn't really gained traction, maybe because people see their approach as a bit too extreme. But hey, at least they stick to their theme of extreme sustainability, even if it's like the most serious take on it. Alright, boom. Marshall Applewhite, founder of Heaven's Gate. This was a cult that had some interesting beliefs. Their main thing was being fully convinced that the aliens were coming to save them. Forget Instagram fame or moving up in your job. These people chose to focus on what they really wanted in life. Catching a ride in a spaceship that's supposedly hiding behind the Hale-Bopp comet. Yup, screw Elon Musk. These guys are clearly much more qualified to lead the charge with space travel. Marshall Applewhite, a man who could be considered one of the strangest space enthusiasts on Earth, joined forces with Bonnie Nettles in the 1970s to create Heaven's Gate. Applewhite wasn't just any ordinary space fan. He saw himself as a messenger with, let's say, divine insight, responsible for guiding his followers to the next level. Members thought that they had to let go of their earthly containers to level up. Every cult really tries their hardest to turn it into a video game, don't they? The concept was simple. The only way to board the spacecraft was through a well-planned, organized, mass exit from life. In March 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet got closer, Applewhite and his 38 devoted followers moved into their California mansion for like the weirdest ceremony they could have held. They had on matching tracksuits and black Nikes. If you're leaving Earth, might as well look fresh. They took some turns eating some poison pudding and then all stopped living. The media went crazy, but who can really say that they're wrong? Just looking at the photos makes you think of a weird field trip that ended horribly. Then there's the Manson family. led by the infamous Charles Manson. This group was more like a horror movie cast in the family. Manson talked about a coming race war that he called Helter Skelter, which, coincidentally, had the same name as the Beatles song. Manson thought that only he could understand the secret messages in the Beatles that predicted war. If you're confused, the authorities were too, because Manson's logic made your typical conspiracy theorist seem reasonable. Manson and his followers carried out a number of violent murders to speed up this war, ending with the murder of Sharon Tate in 1969. The world was stunned as the crimes of the Manson family were revealed. Honestly, how does followers not stop and wonder, wait, are we really following someone who believes Hey Jude is a rallying cry? The Manson family's crimes marked the end of the peace and love era of the 60s, showing that not all families are created equal, especially when their leader has a swastika carved into his forehead. The 6th century BC, a time when you might assume people were busy farming, hunting, and just, surviving. Sure, but at the same time we had nerds. Super nerds. A lot of them. Welcome to the cult of Pythagoras. These people thought that numbers were the most important reality, the sacred truth that formed the basis of everything in the universe. That seems kinda correct, doesn't it? But they were weird, okay? Pythagoras, the man who created the triangle theorem that continues to haunt high school students everywhere, wasn't just a regular math teacher. He thought that numbers had special powers and that knowing them could bring about spiritual awakening. His followers, who were a group of dedicated enthusiasts, made a promise to stay quiet, embraced vegetarianism, and filled their days with thoughts about numbers. And rather than worshipping a god, they chose to worship triangles, which might honestly be the least relatable symbol of spiritual essence or whatever. Pythagoras had very interesting rules. Beans, for example, were straight up banned. What did this man have against beans? Did a bean murder his family? Close, but no. Our buddy Pythagoras was fully convinced that beans had souls. Today, he's known more for his theorem than his revolutionary no-bean policies. The White Brotherhood of the 1920s. Somehow, not racists, but a spiritual group from Bulgaria that focused on purity and enlightenment. Started by Peter Dunov, this group thought that they would cleanse themselves of the world's impurities by using dance, music, and a very strict diet. Fitness was their passion and their religion. Dunov's followers dedicated themselves to spiritual development through a dance known as panarrhythmy, which they thought could purify the soul, which really ended up as a crowd of people dressed in white robes spinning around in the Bulgarian field. They became hella particular about their food choice and eliminated all the impure items to reach enlightenment through strict dieting. And there were a lot of rules. And although it didn't result in mass death or intense mathematical obsession, the White Brotherhood serves as a clear reminder that maybe your quest for spiritual purity has gone off the rails as soon as you start inventing new dance moves. This religion sounds healthy as hell. I don't know about you guys, but I could really use a trainer like Dunov. The Brethren. 1971, right in the center of America, a group called the Brethren popped up. They had one goal: to shun away the comforts of modern living. Picture a world where televisions, automobiles, and pizza delivery are viewed as interruptions from a greater purpose. These people embrace the idea of less is more in a whole new way, getting rid of all the unneeded comforts like, electricity and heating. So like, the Amish, I hear you ask? Nope, this is different, maybe. The Brethren, who were guided by Christian values, sought to live a life without the distractions of the world. When they talked about temptations, they were really referring to anything created after the 18th century. They avoided any personal items, modern hygiene products, and any type of entertainment that wasn't the Bible. Forget about like concerts and movie nights. These folks were deep in meditation always, probably thinking about how nice it would be to have a hot shower. The Brethren, as devoted Christians, just wanted to simplify life, like minimalism to the max. With their fasting, praying, and overall avoidance of anything fun, the Brethren really nailed the less is more lifestyle. The Church of Scientology. This one was started by a sci-fi writer named L. Ron Hubbard. Again, sci-fi writer. The Church of Scientology might be the only group that might turn its own history into a hit movie. Scientology focuses on auditing, which is a method where members share their innermost thoughts and secrets while holding two metal cans linked to an e-meter. It seems like a bit of an exaggerated therapy session, which is probably true. But in this case, it makes sense, because they're trying to get rid of these annoying alien spirits called thetans. Scientology offers spiritual growth, but there's a little twist. The organization thinks that people are everlasting spiritual beings who are burdened by traumas from previous lives, especially those related to aliens, and that only through Scientology can they let go of this cosmic weight. For those who can afford the rising membership fees, they may reach the highest level of that hierarchy, a kind of exclusive VIP area that Hubbard referred to as Operating Thetan. And what's the cost? Oh, just tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars. But does that money even matter when eternal spiritual freedom is at stake? No, didn't think so. The Church of Scientology is very well known for its famous celebrities, as well as its secretive nature, significant wealth, and whispers of a spy network that could rival MI6. Hubbard began his career as a writer of pulp fiction, but he eventually created one of the most debated belief systems out there, the Church of the Firstborn. If you're not feeling well right now, the Church of the Firstborn will definitely not be the best spot for a boost. It was established in 1901, and this Christian group strongly believes that faith alone can cure any sickness. It sees modern medicine as a barrier to spiritual cleanliness. For them, going to the hospital isn't just unnecessary, it's almost like a betrayal. Members of this church think that getting medical help shows a lack of faith in God's ability to heal. And rather than seeking help from doctors, they depend on prayer and anointing with oil, and they just pray for divine intervention to arrive. Unfortunately, this method has frequently led to really bad outcomes, particularly in situations where medical help could have just saved lives. And in certain states, the church has faced legal issues regarding child neglect, showing that while faith can achieve great things, it's not very helpful when treating pneumonia. Even with the debates around it, the church stays true to its beliefs. But you can't stop anyone for their beliefs. People still follow this belief system in the 21st century, which is insane. The coconut cult. Alright, it's about time we talked about the coconut cult from Fiji, where coconuts are more than just a cool drink. They're like a holy spirit. This cult has roots that are hard to trace, maybe because it's such a universal idea. They focus on the coconut as a symbol, and they practice nature-based rituals. They believe that this simple fruit contains the key to life, understanding, and maybe even a delicious pina colada. The coconut cult sees coconuts as representations of purity and spiritual insight. They believe that by eating and respecting coconuts, they're linking themselves to the natural rhythms of the universe and discovering the mysteries of the cosmos. The coconut cult may be one of the least harmful groups on the list. If you want to visit, just get ready to promise your loyalty to a fruit and maybe take enough coconut oil home to last forever. The worst job from every time period. Okay, we all know that YouTuber is the hardest job in the 21st century, but what about the past? Well, I did a bunch of research, and here's the list of the worst job I could find from every historical time period. Starting with tomb builders in ancient Egypt. And these guys' jobs were to build tombs and pyramids in a really hot desert with little food and long working hours, all while they could have gotten killed at any moment by the local wildlife. As a tomb builder, they needed to be able to move and place giant rocks that weighed thousands of pounds, and completely without modern machinery. That in itself took a lot of strength and endurance, but when you realize that these guys worked days that started at sunrise and ended at sunset, it gets a whole lot more painful. But hey, at least they had air conditioning and modern tools. Oh wait, this was 3,000 years ago. The peak of their technology was sharp metal sticks. A lot of the time, that lack of any good equipment would literally break the workers. All the dust coming from the rocks could also lead to them getting huge issues with their lungs over time, not to mention that falling rocks could turn you into a human pancake at any moment. And while you were working, you also had to worry about local wildlife like snakes coming to you, so you couldn't even relax if you were given the chance. Yeah, that's not fun. But if you didn't like building things, you could instead help mine things with the ancient Greeks. Take for example the silver mine workers. These guys were forced to dig and extract silver ore from mines, which required a lot of intense labor. They also only had very basic and often outdated tools with them, making the job a lot harder. Imagine for a second that you're working in a small, poorly ventilated mine, just trying to dig for silver, while touching a lot of toxic materials like lead and mercury would surely give you diseases later on. And suddenly, the tunnel behind you caves in, leaving you trapped in there like a puppy in a tar pit. This was a real scenario for a lot of workers, because the risk of cave-ins, falling rock, and other accidents like accidentally splitting someone's skull with a pickaxe were insanely high. If you were trapped in a cave, they really only came back to save you if they thought you were worth the trouble of saving, so if you were rich or higher status. But the slaves that were most commonly sent to these mines just weren't worth it to the ancient Greeks, so most of the time they just left you to run out of air or to be killed by falling rock. The guys working in these mines were also sent to work very long hours with very little pay, because hey, it's ancient times, slavery laws are still a good 3,000 years away. The combination of the extreme physical labor, toxic exposure to minerals, and harsh treatment by the slave owners meant that mine workers had very short lifespans, often being worked to exhaustion or just dying from diseases. I think I speak for most people here when I say that getting executed isn't that fun. But who knew that having to execute people wasn't fun either? Yeah, I know, it sounds really weird, but it's true. Being an executioner all throughout history sucked so bad that they were just removed from society as a whole. And a lot of times, they were forced to live alone for most of their lives. Executioners had very low social status, and not like the kind slaves had at the time, because people didn't mind them all too much. Yeah, no, people actively tried to stay away from executioners, and they refused to touch them. Also, a lot of the time, they were associated with death, because they, kill people all day. And it probably wasn't that fun to be an executioner either, since today's executions are pretty simple. You just stab someone with a few needles, and they slowly drift off to a stairway to heaven. But no, in the olden days, they just chopped your head off, if you were lucky. There was also a lot of pressure on these guys, since the executions they performed were almost always public events. So if they made a little mistake, they'd have to face a lot of public anger, and it would hurt their reputation. Aw, the poor executioner must be pretty nervous for his big day tomorrow. Alright, next up. We all knew feces was going to be involved at some point. Having to scrub a toilet isn't very fun, but could you imagine having to clean out and transport an entire pit full of human waste? Well, in medieval Europe, this was a real struggle, and gong farmers had to deal with it. Gong farmers were very important in preventing diseases from spreading around towns from these so-called cesspits, which are just pits full of human dump. Now, obviously these cesspits had to be kept somewhat clean, so the entire city wouldn't overflow with human waste and diseases would spread everywhere, so gong farmers would go in and empty these cesspits and move the stuff in them to dumping grounds or fields where it could be used as fertilizer. They were also in charge of maintaining the very little infrastructure they had of sewage systems to make sure that everybody's poop delivery pipes were working good. If you were a gong farmer, you'd have a pretty horrible life. And not just while you're on the job. That's because human waste has a crazy risk for your health because of the bacteria, parasites, and other nasty stuff that's in it. What a surprise. I thought it was clean and healthy. They often got diseases from the job like cholera and typhoid. Gong farmers also had one of the lowest social statuses due to their work because they often faced discrimination because of what they did. And also because of how they smelled, most likely. I mean, it's pretty safe to say they didn't smell great. That's not exactly a brave assumption. Imagine you're in the upper class in 17th century England. Life must be chill, right? You get to go to school, you get to eat good food, you're friends with the prince, and you get whipped every day. Okay, that last part only applied to a specific set of young boys, also known as whipping boys. Whipping boys were often found in royal households where young princes were being educated, and these boys were almost always noble themselves too, so they can be on the same level as the prince. Just worth slightly less than the prince, since they still needed to feed their egos. The job of whipping boy was to take a punishment every single time the prince did something wrong. Since the prince himself couldn't be physically punished by anyone, they just started beating the life out of some random kid that was friends with the prince, because, medieval times. They did it so the prince would develop a sense of responsibility and empathy. Could you imagine being in class and a random kid gets an F on a test, and then the teacher just starts beating the life out of you? Must have been a fun time. These whipping boys were also made to work long hours of work and studying with very few breaks or resting time. Compared to a lot of other jobs in the 1600s, this one wasn't too bad, but then you realize it's happening to literal children. That would be considered insane, and you would get locked up if you did this in today's age. Next, it's no secret that the rich don't care about the lower classes. Even in today's age, Elon Musk would probably be disgusted if he had to talk to a Walmart employee. But things were a whole lot worse in the 1800s. Take, for example, the job of a jam boy. It might sound pretty cool, if you just hear the name itself, but I would rather dig human waste out of a hole than to work this job. If you were a jam boy, your entire job would be to make sure that you get bit by mosquitoes, like you're collecting Pokemon, so the richer people around you don't. You'd most likely be employed around fancy golf courses, and before going on the field, you would cover yourself in sweet materials like, you guessed it, mustard. Nah, I'm kidding, it's jam, so you would attract more mosquitoes. And to make sure that the mosquitoes could easily bite you, you'd be wearing less clothing than your average person on a nudist beach. But if you were really lucky, they would give you a pair of shorts. Then you would just follow the golfers around the course and try to get stung as many times as possible, probably for very little pay. You did, however, get to keep the jam that you rubbed all over your body to bring home to your family, so that's pretty neat, I guess. It totally makes up for the 8,000 itching bite marks you have on your body. Sadly, there's no evidence of this job ever actually existing, as it all just comes from stories that were passed down. But luckily for all the jam boys that would have lived in the 1800s, they wouldn't have to experience being a soldier in the First World War, as there's a good chance that it was probably the worst job anyone's ever had, and it's so much worse than you might think. Apart from the obvious fact that you can get shot through the head at any moment on the day, World War I soldiers had it extremely rough during their time on the battlefield. Or afterwards, actually. Starting with the fact that World War I soldiers were exposed to all sorts of nasty things, like poison gas, plenty of diseases, or rats crawling near, around, or on you. And that's without even looking at the combat side of things. You'd be lucky if you got out of the First World War without injuries, or even alive, because over 20 million people died during the First World War and over 21 million were wounded. If you were injured, you just had to hope that your wound didn't get infected and that there were any beds available for you at the medical tent and that they wouldn't just amputate all your limbs right there because they had no time to treat the wound. And even after the war, it wouldn't be over for these soldiers since a lot of them got shell shock from living in the trenches, which is a form of PTSD. This combined with the fact that soldiers often had to work for years on end with no end in sight, and also very little food, makes it no wonder that people see World War I soldier as such an insanely difficult job, if you can even call it that. And in the modern era, we also still do have some pretty bad jobs, like for example, slaughterhouse workers. This job's bad for a lot of reasons, but the main one is just the insane amount of violence and gruel you see on this job. For example, there's a guy called the Sticker, whose job is to just cut the throats out of cows all day, to make sure that there's no blood in their system before they continue on their journey.